All right, we're going to make our video number 2 for today as we started our ecosystems unit. And I like to always kind of go back and do a little bit of a review of what we talked about from the day before. And the first thing that we talked about was ecosystems. Now, if you remember, we said that by the end of all this, you're going to be able to say, I can identify different factors in an ecosystem and how they interact. Well, yesterday we learned 2 factors, and they actually have the word factor in their vocabulary word in the definition, and that was biotic factor, which was the living things in an ecosystem, and abiotic factor, which were the non-living things. Sunlight, water, temperature, soil are the non-living things. And we learned that in an ecosystem, all the living and non-living things are in that environment, and how they interact is what makes up an ecosystem. So today we're going to learn a little bit more about the different factors, the different things that we might see in an ecosystem that can make it very unique, and how it helps different ecosystems function in different ways. And they will fall into the category of biotic factors. And we'll get to some abiotic later. So I'm going to skip through the quiz. We've already gone through the quiz. Hopefully you were able to watch the videos yesterday here and here. But today we're going to start talking about producers. Now, producers are an organism that makes their own food. And like I said, that doesn't mean I go to the oven or I go to the microwave and I make a Hot Pocket or some pizza bites. That doesn't mean I made my own food. No, an organism that makes its own food is a plant. And the reason why is they use sunlight, and when the sun shines on them through a process called photosynthesis, they're able to create sugars inside of themselves, so they make their own food that way. They create their own food. Now, if you can walk into the kitchen and somehow magically get full, that might be a little bit different. If we could stand outside and soak up sunlight, and that's how we got our energy, that's how we made our food, then we would be producers, but we're not. Plants are producers. So an organism that makes its own food is a producer. Trees, grass, algae, water plants. Most of the time they're green due to the chlorophyll. Although the leaves change color, and a tree is still a producer in the winter, and we'll get into the reason why leaves fall off and things like that later. But most of your producers are going to be green. And we have that because of the chlorophyll inside of them, and that's what allows them to go through the process of photosynthesis. So we don't just have producers. And again, producers, they are biotic factors. They're alive. We have something called consumers. And some people today, when we talked about this definition, they're like, Mr. Bullens, that definition doesn't make any sense. And I understand that when you first hear it. But after today, I think it's going to make you understand. Consumers is like the giant title, okay? Any animal that eats, which by the way is all animals, is going to fall under the category of it's a consumer. It has to consume things. It has to consume things in order to survive, in order to live. It has to eat in order to live. Now, as we look at this, if an animal eats plants, if an animal eats animals, maybe an animal eats both, it is a consumer. And so we're going to take that giant category of consumer, which is every animal eats, and we're going to break it down into some subcategories, and we're going to define them by what they eat. We're going to define these consumers by what they eat, and depending upon what they pick, it changes them and puts them into different categories. Our first category that we'll look at is herbivore. Then we'll look at carnivore. Then we're going to look at omnivore. And so these are 3 classifications of consumers because they all eat, but they eat very specific things. Herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores all eat very specific things. Herbivores. Now, if I look in the background, I see the grass. Deer, horses, rabbits, cows, sheep, koalas are herbivores. Why are they called that? Because they only eat plants. If you go in the kitchen and you start to cook, You might use herbs. I know last night, I think we used some parsley. I think we used some thyme, and those are herbs. Basil is an herb. Some people may even have an herb garden at your house. Small little plants that you're growing like just outside of your house or in your kitchen windowsill that you use while you're cooking. They are plants. If you only eat those, the only thing you eat is plants, you are an herbivore. An herbivore is what we call something that only eats plants. So we look at some of those things, and if they only take part of eating a plant. Now, Nico asked a great question. Mr. Bullis, what if something only eats fruit? A fruit comes from a plant. It is the fruit of a plant. It's still considered part plant, and therefore, if you only ate apples every day, you would then be an herbivore. So if you only eat plants, you are an herbivore. That takes me to my second category of consumers, and that is your carnivore. Now, I know that when I was working in the restaurant, if I needed steak or something in meat, I would ask for carne. I think it was spelled with an E, but that meant meat. Carnivores only eat meat. They only eat meat. So your lions, your tigers, eagles, sharks, snakes, spiders. Spiders, they eat meat? Yes, they eat insects. They eat the meat of an insect. They are carnivores because they only eat meat. So when you think of herbivores, break it down to that small little word. And easy way to remember, herbivores, herbs are plants. That means if you're an herbivore, you eat plants. Carnivore is very similar. Break it down by the first portion here, carne. And that means that you only eat meat. So we have herbivores. We have our carnivores. But then I start thinking about some things. And some things eat both meat and plants. If I'm only eating plants, I'm an herbivore. If I'm only eating meat, I'm a carnivore. But if I eat both, I'm going to consider myself as an omnivore. And most humans are omnivores, although there are some humans that choose to only eat plants, and that's fine. But there are other examples. Bears, black bears are omnivores. Primates, omnivores. And we go to this word here, omni. It's an old Latin prefix meaning all, meaning they eat everything. They eat it all. They eat plants and they eat animals. Kind of like me today for lunch, I'm having salad with a chicken breast on top because that's what I'm eating. So that would put me in the category of omnivore because I eat everything. And it's important to understand that those three different categories of consumers. And there are a couple of other things that really do fall into a very odd category. And you really can't place them specifically into one of the categories. And that are my scavengers and my decomposers. They don't perfectly fit into that category, those three main categories of consumers. Now, scavengers, they eat the meat, the bones, the fur, they eat it all of dead and decaying animals. So you see that dead deer on the side of the road, and then you see those big giant birds that are eating it. They're pecking at the fur, they're pecking at the meat, they're eating the bones. They eat a little bit of everything of that, but they are scavengers. And it's important to differentiate them. I know that they eat meat. I know that, and I know that they break that down like that, but they're eating all of it. And they have a very specific role in the ecosystem, and their role is to get rid of those dead and decaying things. And it's very important that we have scavengers. But there's something that kind of goes even a little bit further than just a scavenger, and it'll break down the meat and the bones and stuff of dead animals, but it'll also break down dead and decaying plant material as well. And they're hugely important in the ecosystem, and they are decomposers. Decomposers are earthworms, as you can see here, bacteria, and fungi, a very weird word, fungi, which basically boils down to being mushrooms. And fungi, earthworms, bacteria, and fungi are all decomposers. What they do is they break down dead plants or dead animals, and they release all of the nutrients and the minerals inside of those dead things back into the soil, and they make very good soil. So when you have things that do die, maybe a giant tree falls in the forest, and over a long period of time, fungi and bacteria and worms are breaking that down. They're breaking it down, releasing all the nutrients that are stored inside of that tree back into the soil, and it turns the soil into very, very good soil for other things to start growing in. So obviously decomposers and scavengers have a huge influence on the way an ecosystem operates. They have a huge influence on the health of an ecosystem. They help make sure it remains healthy so that you don't consistently have this dead and decaying material consistently forming in all of those areas. We're going to stop today with producers, consumers, and decomposers, and within consumers we're going to talk about our herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. I'm going to leave those slides to you, and we're going to stop there for today.